Howdy folks, Frank the Drifter from Dollar Country here. For a while now I've wanted to expand Dollar Country to include interviews in addition to the music. I wanted to be able to talk with and share the viewpoints and stories of other people in the greater country music world, anywhere from fellow collectors to artists to really anyone I might think would be interesting to talk to. Before, I hadn't had the time to get this going, but thanks to quarantine I do now. For the first episode I got to have a chat with Nick Shoulders, a country music songwriter and performer based out of New Orleans, although at the time of our chat he was in Arkansas holing up on a mountaintop. Nick is on a very short list of modern country artists that I really enjoy. All of you that listen to the show regularly won't be surprised to hear me say that my bread and butter, country music-wise, is stuff from the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So new stuff doesn't really get me going that often, but whatever Nick is doing sure hits the sweet spot for me. I've included a couple of his songs in the interview, and if you want to check out more, I'll put the links in the description of the show. Or you can go to nickshoulders.bandcamp.com. Being as this is the first episode of a new thing, I'd like to preface by saying this is a pilot. The normal show is recorded straight through as if it's live on the radio with no editing, unless something goes wrong, of course. So editing down an interview is not really something that I'm very used to. I'm happy with the results, but I wouldn't call them professional, so please forgive any mess. I'll be posting the whole unedited interview on the Patreon for my supporters, so if you'd like to hear the whole thing, you can go to patreon.com/dollarcountry and donate to the show that way. If you're new to Dollar Country, you can check out the over 100 other episodes I have at dollarcountry.org or on Spotify, iTunes, or Mixcloud, all featuring old forgotten country 45s I travel around the country and dig for in the dusty dollar bins of America. And you can follow me at Dollar Country on Facebook, Instagram, or Twitter, or get a hold of me at host@dollarcountry.org via email. So without further ado, here's my chat with Nick Shoulders.
Hello.
Hey, hello.
Hello. I think we're working. How's things?
Good, man.
Yeah, same. It's kind of, this is cool because I only hear you in like a press play sort of scenario typically. So
yeah, I've been
thinking on a conversational basis.
I've thought about that too because we've both heard each other's voices a number of times, and we've spoken through messaging, but we've never actually spoken to each other with our voices at the same time.
Yeah, it's I don't know. I've been having a couple of these like conversation podcast interview things, and they're all, I feel like, way more nerve-wracking when you just don't have any reference whatsoever on who you're about to speak to, especially because I've had like some of these country cats and they're like, yeah, I want to talk to you and I want to talk to you about this thing, and I'm like, oh God, am I about to talk to somebody that's like really bummed about that that situation? Like, am I going to hear them complaining about me yodeling against Donald Trump or something, you know? So it's like it's good to have a more or less an understanding of who you're speaking to before it happens.
Yeah, for sure. I hear that.
You're kind of going out on a limb, which I think is pretty neat.
Yeah. I basically, I mean, the name of the game for almost everything I do at this point is just like, I really wanted someone to do something, and then I just decided to do it myself.
Nice. Yeah. I mean, when I tell people the premise of your show and they're like, you know, in the same sort of stripe as me in terms of our relationship to old music, their eyes just get big. They're like, whoa, cool. That's awesome. I'm definitely going to check that out. So I've been trying my best to get everybody turned on to your podcast. It's one of my favorites.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I'm lucky to have accrued some pretty serious fans who, from what I hear, go around and tell a lot of other people about the show.
Well, you know, it's like, with that whole New Orleans scene, it's such a everybody down there is so enamored with source material, and that's kind of our whole shtick, is like that we listen to the older stuff more, or maybe like in different ways, like we listen to it harder or something, and it's cool to like be able to bring some variety in there, because we not that you don't just all the time, but like I know Jimmy Rogers front to back. I know Riley Puckett front to back. Like, I've heard this stuff for years and years now. So like to be able to just get somebody else's sort of curated, like tasteful insight into like a group of performers that I hadn't heard before, that no one has really heard before. It's really damn neat. It does the trick for a lot of us. I'll tell you what.
Yeah, good, man. I'm glad. It's Yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there. It's kind of insane how much stuff there is out there, actually, besides like the big names. Because with the big names in country music, it's already such a gigantic genre that there's like you could listen to just people who are well known and like be completely satisfied with hearing tons and tons of country. But then there's this like other undercurrent of like almost as much music that was just recorded like locally or regionally or by just like regular people or people who never made enough to quit their day jobs, sort of people. It's kind of it's kind of insane how much there is out there.
Right. And I think that's where the actual magic of, and maybe like what is truer to the like idea of what country music actually is in terms of like if you're taking that more literally, because when you get those regional interpretations that aren't sort of colored by the more aspirational like national sound, you get something way cooler and way more unique. And like, just to hear stuff from a corner of the country that you could say like that sounds like it would be from that corner of the country because of this influence and this little thing and like this reference, like, and all the local disaster songs and stuff. That's such a cool,
Yeah, those
like,
are cool.
archival thing to be able to pile up. Like I really love those songs.
Yeah, I like those too because I think it kind of reminds me of like I grew up playing Dungeons and Dragons with my friends, and I always liked the idea of like back in the day, you would hear about news because basically somebody who played guitar would travel around to different taverns, like back in like before there was any sort of recorded music. And you can see a lot. You can see a lot of that in early country music, where it's like these people are like they're bards. Basically, they're telling the story of current news so that it could spread around. Because before the advent of like, I mean, there's been newspapers, but before like the radio, it was very hard to get a story very far very quickly.
Totally.
So you have a lot of people like telling these stories through song, and of course, there's like some artistic license in how they tell it, I'm sure, but for the most part it was like a really interesting way to spread current events around.
Well, and I think that it's neat too because I feel like there's a lot of those like kind of standards in the genre. Like think about a Frankie and Johnny or something that there's a million versions of, and it's like that probably was one town and one wife who got tired of her husband running around on her and like went and shot him, and then that
Yeah.
became like a little local bard, and then that got passed down, and then boom, you got Frankie and Johnny.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I think that kind of thing's like the archaeology of music is what I think gets lost on a lot of people, but I view this as like a it's like it's digging up fossils. You're digging actually through like the physical archives of the music.
For sure. That's kind of the fun part about it for me is finding stuff, especially because a lot of the stuff when I started the show, it was a lot more. I played a lot more better known artists just because my collection was a lot more shallow. And since I've dug a lot more stuff, it's gotten to the point where the majority of shows, at least half the stuff I play is stuff that I can't find almost any information on the internet.
That's been my experience is that I'll find stuff or like you'll post things or talk about how you can't find anything on it, and I'll do like a light look myself. I'm like, yeah, that is utterly mysterious. I have
crazy.
no idea what the hell that is.
Yeah, I actually, you mentioned it a few minutes ago, but I was going to ask because I'm kind of interested just in like regional histories, but you were saying in that other podcast about how there's just a lot of people in New Orleans playing the sort of music you do, and you get to like, there's like country dances and like a scene of like active country music players and listeners down there right now.
Mm-hmm.
What is like the genesis of that? Is that something that's been around for a long time, or is it something that's been blooming in the past like few years?
See, that's something that I'm gonna assume that somebody out there can answer it better than I can in the scene. But my synopsis that I've kind of gleaned from it is that a few folks like Linda and Sam Doors and Pat Reedy and these folks that were all in sort of the traveling scene. Who were more like playing on street corners and busking and stuff, made their way to New Orleans and started putting together stuff like sundown songs, which eventually became something like Hooray for the Riff Raff. And there's really just sort of the busking culture, I think, is what drew people there. But that's one specific tangent. And I used to kind of think that the answer for our scene was that simple, is that, those nerds made it down there and were doing something cool. And then a bunch of other nerds heard that and came flocking afterwards. And that's basically what happened. But I happened to find this music video by the Goodbye Tanyas where they were playing on the levee in Holy Cross in the late 90s. And I was like, holy crap, this is like where I live pre-Katrina, you know, seeing all this stuff. And like these people are like, you know, banjo playing weirdos, traveling around New Orleans doing this kind of what I think people who do understand the history of music in New Orleans would consider sort of incongruent music with that history. But it's not like it just started with the folks that I mentioned. And then I started recognizing some of those banjo playing weirdos as like Grayson of Mountain Sprout, which is a band that is active in Northwest Arkansas that I grew up going to see. And like Reverend Coy Dog and all these folks is like sort of became regionally known to me by just going to their shows when I was younger. And I always kind of had this knowledge like, oh yeah, those guys, you know, they were buskers in New Orleans and street musicians, and they used to play like kind of wacky up-tempo banjo honky-tonk music kind of stuff. And they've since migrated north back to where they're from and are taking that street culture and that idea of that up-tempo stuff with them. But really, I think the whole thing that holds the glue that holds all those different types of reactions to old country together from New Orleans is that partner dancing. But the dance scene in South Louisiana never died. You know, it kind of became other things or got adapted into other types of dances or really just disappeared altogether everywhere else. But between the Cajun dancing of the Cajun Prairie and Lafayette area and Eunice and all the sort of like really deep, true Cajun culture, and then that's got an overlap with the blues dancing and the swing and jazz and everything of New Orleans, and it's created this weird hybrid dance culture where it's, you know, a lot of it rock and roll, but really the core motivator of all that New Orleans style country is partner dancing, and you can hear it. It's all got that kind of backbeat to it, that danceable beat. So when we're writing songs, we're writing for a dance floor, which I think you can hear in the music and makes it different than most country here, which is nowadays mostly observational. But having an active dance scene really changes it, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I think that also just having a very small amount of people who are willing to go out to shows and dance, having like the seed of that sort of stuff makes a scene much easier to go to as well.
Totally, and it's very much like organic and voluntary. It doesn't really feel like everybody's forced to go. And I'm sure when it was smaller or maybe just like more fledgling, it felt like people were more obligated to be a part of it. But from what I've been a part of the last 4 or 5 years or so, going down there and seeing it, it's very much like there's a huge revolving cast of people from all over that come in and out of New Orleans throughout the year. And then there's a group that hold it down on the ground, and all of them really don't have much of a problem with going out 5 days a week to dance, and I think that's what holds it all together.
On a lonely night like any other in a place I'm known to go, to croon a song to a patient throng of folks that you might know, to sing the songs of hard times, hard feelings and hardened hearts, but nothing seemed to grab them until a patron he remarked, won't you play it in G for Jesus and let your Holy Spirit show? Keep your pain and your midnight trains, and on to higher ground we'll go. Don't sing the songs about whiskey, and I'm so lonesome that Mama tried. So play it in G for Jesus, and you might leave this bar alive. So I swallowed hard and I scanned the bar for an exit I might tread. It occurred that I might could see the light if it meant I could earn my bread. I strummed this chord to the waiting Lord, fixed him in my gaze, and no minor key escaped me while old Gabriel's trumpet played. And I played it in G for Jesus. I let my Holy Spirit
it definitely seems like there's a lot of there's a lot of punk roots in the country music scene down there.
Totally. Well, I mean, my trajectory was that I started on drums. Well, I mean, I grew up hearing my grandfather's weird gospel and country, and my grandfather on the other side was a singer, and I have his fiddle and can't play it. And my grandma, our great grandma, was a gospel singing instructor. So I had all this exposure to these old vocal styles and old instrumentation things, and really kind of as a means to feel like I could get out of Arkansas, rejected a lot of it. So I didn't really like want to be too hard into that stuff, and then eventually got into the punk music and started doing that full time. But I didn't play a guitar tuned to standard like a normal human being writing songs until like 3 years ago. I was just playing like open C slide guitar, screechy thrash stuff. So like it's not even been like I was a high school punk or something. Like I was fully in a regionally established like good hardcore band up until pretty recently, and then just decided that I was going to go after the grandpa music because I felt more qualified for it. Because I don't know, I felt like way more of a try-hard trying to do the punk thing and like make those sorts of noises than I did as soon as I was like writing songs like this. I was like, actually, I think this is where my skill set really falls into, is this stuff. So I was grateful that I made the transition, but I definitely, I mean, like I said, I was just this year working on that doom band down there, so it's not like I've given up on my fuzz pedal. It's just a different world.
Right. It is kind of it does kind of feel try hard sometimes, because I think that metal and punk is kind of to the normal American or normal human is innately kind of unwelcoming.
Oh yeah.
And I mean, that's kind of the point, especially with punk, is that you're trying to present ideas that are against the status quo or make people think about things differently. Whereas I view country music as kind of innately welcoming, because Americans are just so used to it. Like it is like with like blues and like early rock and roll is the music of America. Like it's very, very American in a lot of ways that we're just so used to it. It's not uncomfortable at all.
No, and I think that sort of presenting ideas, like trying to move the needle a little bit, is the job of those sort of vanguard, periphery, like kind of scarier genres. And I was grateful to be a part of that. And I think that having that sort of fundamental motivation, this happens to everybody. I'm sure you could talk to anybody in a lot of different facets of whatever you want to call it, Americana, new country, who had a moment dealing with punk and metal and with those types of genres and crossed over. And I really think that there's not too much of a difference in sort of the fundamental motivator of the genres. Like the Woody Guthrie transition is definitely something that I've watched play out in a million people, where they hate country music and then they listen to Woody Guthrie and they're like, oh wait, this guy had like some radical ideas, and they're like, yeah, that's cool. Well, check out all these people who actually informed Woody Guthrie and created Woody Guthrie, because he's sort of an amalgamation of all these other traditions. And that source material spins people off into this whole other thing where they realize that the disenfranchisement that makes punks want to yell at the top of their lungs about how things need to change is the same disenfranchisement that kept those people in poverty and in dire circumstances and created this beautiful music out of those dire circumstances. So I think that they're really not too far off the mark in a weird way that a lot of people don't connect the dots until they really visit that source material heavily.
Yeah, it's true. Although country does have it's I would consider country to be stereotypically seen as like a conservative art form, like conservative politically, especially.
Totally. And, I had the great pleasure of becoming a published author on the subject, and I feel like that was definitely, I had to talk to both people who don't give a damn about country music and don't care about knowing the history, and folks that are super huge into nerding out on that source material. So I feel like I had to give a very simplified version of how that all went down. But yeah, that's something that like I'm very interested in as being someone who's very invested in growing up in the South and dealing with the legacy of all of that and how it relates to the image of country music and being unwelcoming to people. I think I'm just trying to make country music for people that don't like country music or have felt unwelcome by country music. And that's important to me, because I was one of those people. And I definitely shied away from participating in the genre or really wanting to make that music, even though it was part of my identity and my upbringing because of those associations. And I think that's horribly unfortunate because there's so many people out there who would make beautiful stuff that could fall into the country genre, but they feel repulsed by the fact that they feel like they're sort of pledging allegiance to folks that, don't necessarily believe in the same things they do to an extent, which is fine. But I think the more venomous aspect is that those things that they don't believe in harm or marginalize or freak people out to this point where they feel unsafe. And I just want country music to feel safer for folks.
Yeah, for sure. I actually, one of the things I liked, you sent me the OK Crawdad record, which is your most recent one. And I had that CD in my car and it kind of like sat in there. It was just one of those things that like I put in my car and didn't take out for a while. I listened to it a bunch of times. But one of the things I really enjoyed were the two songs, Bound and Determined and The World Needs Sissies Too, which I think I sent you a message about, but specifically I feel like so much country either tries to be apolitical or just reinforces very conservative tropes over and over. And I thought that the way you wrote those songs and the message you were sending was, first of all, very, it wasn't like angering. Like, I feel like a lot of times when people write music that are charged politically, it's like trying to be in your face and angry. And I felt those songs offered like very good reasons to think about things differently. And, also were really good songs. I hope I'm getting my point across, but I just felt like they were like, you were saying something that I really felt like I don't hear enough in country music, and you said it in a way that I thought was not grating and was very interesting and well spoken.
Well, I appreciate that was the interpretation, because I was afraid of that, putting it out there that I was going to be browbeating people or that I was going to be, a trillion protest songs have all fallen on deaf ears. We know this as well as anybody, but I think that plays into what I was saying, that I really would like country music to be more welcoming to more types of people. And in this day and age, unfortunately, if you aren't actively putting any effort into sort of combating these ideas that are oppressive and are infringe on people's rights and keep people afraid or keep them poor, if you're not speaking up in a sense, then unfortunately in a way you're complicit. And I think there's a way to speak up that says, hey, I understand you to an extent. I see where you're coming from, but here's why maybe you should rethink that stance, or I'm not trying to fundamentally have people question their entire worldview, even though parts of people's entire worldview maybe is at odds with how I feel. But I think it makes a difference that I came from where I came from in terms of, physically and culturally and the whole nine yards, that I feel for those folks, because the world's changing and the world is a lot different than a lot of folks expected it to be when they were forming their idea of how their lives were going to go. And that's challenging. And there's just so much out there speaking to those insecurities. There's so many people that are telling them, no, you're not wrong to feel that way. You're right. Here's why. We have all these, alternative facts. We have ways to make you feel like your opinion is valid. And that's a really powerful motivator. So I think when folks come from outside that perspective and want to change people's minds, they don't actually understand what's freaking those people out. And they feel like they are able to write them off. Whereas I can't write them off. These are my family members, my neighbors, people I adore, people I went to school with, and we all have that. It's not like that's unique to my experience, but I might have just been too close to it for a lot longer, and I feel like I can speak to folks that maybe would not want to listen to somebody from a different background. So, not that I have any sort of like green pass into any argument about conservatism versus how country music should be more progressive, but I have a perspective, and I wanted to lend it, and it's been really humbling and flattering and all the things to have people respond to it positively, which has been the majority of folks. I haven't had to defend those songs from somebody that's really, really pissed about that yet. So it's been nice that's been well received, because those songs are very important to me in that sense.
Yeah, well, I think that you present it in a way that allows discussion. I think the problem, if I was to boil down what I see as some of the major problems with just the world today, is that there's a lot of people who want to espouse their view like out loud, but don't actually want to have a discussion with people they disagree with. They just want someone else to kind of magically change their mind. And I feel like that we're losing that aspect of being able to discuss with people we disagree with, and being able to talk about, well, like, why do you think that? And being able to understand and love the other people that you disagree with, but at the same time feel comfortable disagreeing with them, or being able to talk with them about why they might think something.
Right. And I think something to sort of walk into any of those conversations with, or have in mind, is that you don't really arrive at conclusions that are extreme and that put other people down from a place of security. You don't become ideologically so polarized on one end that you feel this way about folks because you're stoked about your life or the world or how things are. Like, being kind to people who feel, that I think what I try to, when I have had these conversations, it's like, do you feel like you got a raw deal? Do you feel oppressed? Well, it's probably not the people you think it is, or that you've been told to blame, that are really making, things different or difficult for you. Like there are outlets and there are ways to make the world better that benefit everybody, and it doesn't have to be tribal and self-serving. But they've been offered, a lot of us have been offered, a way to confirm our biases that already existed. And that's true of the entire political spectrum. I'm not going to say that it's just one side or the other, but it really is remarkable if you just take a little time to espouse some kindness and try to understand where somebody's coming from, how quickly they'll become less combative themselves. We're in this because we like each other. We wouldn't be talking and trying to figure this out because we think we can all survive on our own. Like, we need each other. And so I think that's where I'm trying to offer a different sort of lens, is that, hey, I as the chorus of Bound and Determined says, I leave the door open for you. I want you back. I want you to be my friend and to be back on the side. But it's going to require that, we both take a hard look at the world and what's going on. And, it doesn't take a ton to be nice to folks. And I appreciate that you say that in the podcast, because I think that's a really good message.
Yeah, I don't even know how I came upon that. I just started saying it one day.
I always wait for it when I show people an episode or something. I'm like, oh, hey, check this. This is like the cool little the footnote at the end, the period at the end of the sentence of the podcast. It's a nice gesture. I really do think.
I am so weary, I'm as clone as I can be. All y'all have lost it. I meet your madness with pity. I don't blame you for being scared, but it's the wrong direction that your teeth are bared. We're fully busted. We know the ship is run aground. The things you trusted, they burned the farm and moved to town, and no freedom or security in dreams. Is life worth living if there's lead in the last stream? To a glutton, what's allegiance worth if the meek like me are to inherit the earth? It's not oppression to ask for basic decency. You'll learn your lesson while you're repeating history. And if this song gets me shot, at least my voice, it wasn't silent. You'll forget me not. I keep the door open for you, bound and determined. Oh, you can't lie to me. Oh, bound and determined. Oh, to ruin everything. You ruin everything. You ruin everything. You'll ruin everything.
But yeah, so you're from Arkansas originally.
Yeah, I kind of have like a weird pan-Arkansan pedigree. My family's been in the state since 1850, down like on the Louisiana line, deep South Arkansas. From central Arkansas, outside of Little Rock originally, and then we moved up to the Ozarks when I was pretty young. So I've got the like family background of deep South Arkansas, and then the original upbringing of the Ouachita foothills, and then Ozarks after that. So the Ozarks are kind of their own thing, obviously, but anywhere inside of Arkansas is pretty similar. It's remarkable talking to somebody from West Helena or Fort Smith. You know, they have some of the same things in common just by being from such a weird little backwater of a state. So it's a strange place, but yeah, I'm definitely born, bred, and buttered in the natural state.
Do you consider Arkansas to be part of the South?
This is an interesting discussion that I get to have pretty often, but I think there's like 4 different sort of definitions that are equally valid of what the South is. There's sort of the geographic South, which I think is what people in South Louisiana consider the South, which is like if a palmetto doesn't grow past your knee, then you're a Yankee or something.
Uh-huh.
And then there's sort of the cultural broader version where I consider Southeast Kansas part of the South. You know, mid-tier Illinois, you can find people with weak vowels. So I think that's sort of the peripheral South, and how far you can trace out where the accent and especially the sort of types of people that immigrated and made up those communities are pretty homogenous to an extent. At least they're similar through that whole zone. And then there's just sort of the tried and true and really dismal version of the South, which is just anywhere that's seceded from the Union. Mm-hmm. And I think every ex-Confederate state has a lot of the same problems, a lot of the same demography. I think that's really the most important definer of whether a place is the South, quote unquote, or not, is that legacy of war and slavery, and then what happened afterwards, basically, 150 years of a white terror state, like that really it leaves an indelible mark on the cultural makeup of those places. So I think that, yeah, as much as somebody from Macon, Georgia, or, Virginia might not want to own Arkansas or Louisiana, for that matter, as part of the South, especially the eastern half of the state that borders Mississippi and Tennessee, that's undeniably part of the Deep South. We got cottonmouths and hanging moss and alligators and all that fun stuff. It's not outside of what people think of as maybe the stereotypical Southern things, but I think it's a lot harder for people to imagine the Ozarks as being part of the South, just because it's further north and it's more Appalachian in appearance and culture. But really, I think that it comes down to vowels. If you read up on what people think the Southern accent is, it's very varying. But as far as I understand, linguists use the pin thing. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Oh, yeah, I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, so if you say pin and pin, if what you write with and stick in a voodoo doll are the exact same word, then you fall into the greater southeastern dialect group. And that extends, like I said, into Kansas, halfway through Missouri, half of Oklahoma. But I think that cultural South, that kind of Confederate adjacent communities, that's important to consider, because those people vehemently believe they were raised in the South. Like if you were to talk to somebody in the most northern county of Arkansas bordering Missouri, like they would vehemently say, yes, I'm a Southerner, I was born and bred in the South. And they may not have ever seen hanging moss or an alligator or anything like that, So
Right.
I would honestly like to think that Arkansas is a bit of a subregion within of its own, because it's got such a unique history. But if I'm to answer the question simply, I at least say at least half of Arkansas is definitely in the South.
Oh yeah, I was gonna ask you earlier when you mentioned your family playing, like being musicians. Did you grow up around music in the house? Were people like singing and playing live music in the house?
It's interesting because yes and no. My parents are, for lack of a better descriptor, they're jocks. They're like athletes.
Uh huh.
They ran marathons together and co-owned a gym. Like they're definitely more concentrated on athletics. And so I was around my dad's whistling. He's an incredible whistler, and he was really comfortable with volume, so he was a loud singer, but he couldn't play a note on anything. But his dad was a singer and a whistler and a multi-instrumentalist. He played violin and guitar and had a big stack of 78s of like Western swing and cool old country music and stuff. So I got a little bit of that from that side, but really what I was internalizing in terms of vocal styles was mostly from my Arkansas side of the family. And so that would have been my grandparents down there in Little Rock, who had this kind of deep South gospel vibrato thing going on that I'm sure carried from, well, my grandmother's side's from Louisiana, and my grandfather was from, I mentioned that county that was almost Louisiana, South Arkansas. So they're bringing like a much more deep South influence vocal tradition. So I think for me, I really didn't latch onto that stuff earlier. I mostly made fun of it. So I learned to sing like my grandfather, basically by kind of making fun and like mocking it. And it was all in good taste, or, I was having fun, but I didn't get to hear it in the sense that I was like, someone who stuck a guitar in my hand at 8 years old and was like, sit here in the circle and we're jamming with the old folks. Like nothing like that entirely. I was learning to do this stuff in pretty much utter isolation. Like I figured out the bird calls and all that stuff and sort of ran with it by myself, because I didn't have anyone to support that. Like I had to beg my dad for a drum set from Walmart when I was 13 years old. Nobody was trying to get me to play music, and I wouldn't say it was the opposite. Like people were trying to get me to resist playing music, but it definitely was not part of the home growing up. It was more functional. It's like, again, the whistling and the hooting and hollering and stuff, that was just kind of a byproduct of us being people. It didn't feel purposeful or any. I didn't know I was a part of any sort of vernacular tradition by learning to whistle like a cardinal for my dad. It just seemed like something we did,
Right. It was just like part of your household.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, they say that there's I read about a lot of cultures where singing is just like, it's not seen, singing isn't seen as something that some people do. It's just like something everybody does at certain times. Like singing isn't like something you're good or bad at. It's just like part of like a small like area's culture.
Ooh, I love that idea.
Yeah.
Well, that's kind of like something my grandma told me one time, because when I first started really concentrating on this, like the grandpa country and stuff, I started going to visit my grandparents more, and I'd sing for them and play them songs and stuff, and discover all the songs that they knew and that they wanted me to play, or things that about that music that they could tell me that I wouldn't have been able to know just by listening to whatever Red River Dave on YouTube or something. Like I got this little insight that was really valuable. But something my grandma used to say is that men used to whistle, she said. And she talked about how her father and her grandfather, and I think her uncle they were railroad mechanics and worked for Missouri Pacific, and they whistled constantly. And that she was saying that vibrato thing, the little warble that I can get out of the whistle, it's something she remembered hearing from her father or grandfather. I'm going to have to go back and listen to the tapes to get it right. But either way, there was this sort of generational thread of whistlers. And she said, people used to whistle and they got good at it. And like, that wasn't annoying or like a put on. Like that's something everybody did, because we all wanted to hear music, but didn't have a phone in your pocket or even radios. So like people being able to whistle just gave you that moment of clarity where you could feel like you were part of a song or hearing a song, and that was really important for folks. And in that same token, I think like maybe a month later, I was at a punk show and I heard somebody say something to the effect of like, "What's up with straight white men whistling? Like, why can't they just stop whistling badly?" And I thought, oh, I think the answer lies somewhere in between, where like it's not normalized enough for people to hear each other doing it well and to get better at it. And so you're kind of left with people they're yearning for that same expression and that same sort of casual context to interacting with music, but they just lack the same sort of reflex with it. And I think I got really lucky to have the exposure to where it did become a reflex. It never felt like a put on. And I started realizing what that meant when I was playing music with people outside of Arkansas who were playing the nerdy old country, and they're like, where'd you get that whistling thing? What is that? And I had to admit, it's like, I don't know. It's just I always grew up doing it. My dad did it and his dad did it before him. And I mostly learned to try to screw around communicating with whippoorwills and cardinals and chickadees and stuff. It wasn't an exercise in old music. It's just something we did. So I think that's totally cool. The idea of just like it being a reflex and that everybody does it, because we don't get enough of that anymore. It's so formalized now.
Right, and I think that it's very common to see music as a competition for a lot of people. Like, who's the best drummer, who's like the best band around, instead of viewing it as just each person having their own thing. You know, like it's sometimes people boil down music to being like, oh, well, this is the best band, this is my favorite band, instead of it being like, well, all these bands are great in their own way, or all these people have interesting voices in their own way. And I feel like that's kind of ingrained in our culture to be competitive.
Well, I think that's the beauty of the stuff that you dig up, the recordings that you dig up, because those people couldn't hope to compete a lot of times. You know, like the folks that are on some local label in, Sand Hill, Alabama or whatever, that are putting out a couple of songs, like, maybe they wanted to be on the Grand Ole Opry, but really they're kind of an extension of that tradition of just everybody sings, and that's what we do. And so you get this sort of thing where you can listen to those recordings and find things that are compelling and wonderful about them without having to say like, oh yeah, you got to hear this is the best set of harmonies you'll ever hear. Instead, like, yeah, listen to how like wonky and sick this is. Like, listen to how natural and entertaining this performer is, rather than it being like technically precise or just sort of being the best. I think that lack of competitiveness really shows in some of those recordings, and I really think that's cool.
Yeah, that's what I really like about it too, because at a young age, I remember I was in a music store. I play drums as well, and so I was like in the music store just talking to the dude working there, and he mentioned that like, oh yeah, like Victor Wooten was in town, and Victor Wooten and his brother came into the store and were like playing music with each other, and like invited anybody who to come in to just like play. And the guy was like, yeah, it was crazy. It was like, no matter who was playing music with them, they loved it. It wasn't a competition at all. It was just about like everybody has their own personality and their own way of playing, and like they like celebrated everybody's personality no matter how they played it. And that was the first like click in my mind that was like, oh yeah, it's not about like being the best or whatever. It's about like finding your voice and speaking it.
Totally. And I really love that notion. And I feel like I was imbued a little bit with that. Like, my dad listened to some Bob Wills and Roger Miller and stuff. Like I got exposed to some of that cool older country growing up, but really he was a classic rock guy, and his hero was Keith Moon. And I was taught very early, again, as like begging that Walmart drum set off my dad at 13, that like the best drummer of all time was Keith Moon. And it's not because he was the best drummer of all time. It's because he was the most entertaining. He was the most revolutionary in terms of the stuff he came up with. And like, I think that sort of value set of like finding things about a player that aren't necessarily like technically precisely the best, but really what makes them a lovable performer. Like that's what's important. And I don't know. I wish more people thought of it that way, but it's cool to hear. And I think Victor Wooten's pretty cool, so it's nice to hear that they feel that way about music. So I think that kind of value is understated, but totally still a thread for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think country music is a form of music that is relatively non-competitive in that manner. I think a lot of people talk about their different country musicians being their favorite because of, what their voice sounds like or what they sing about. It's not just about like really good guitar players or really good musicians, because in a lot of ways it wasn't about the musicians at all. Mm-hmm. Country has such a history of, basically having one band for 100 different artists, or, it doesn't really matter like if this drummer's like really hot or the solo is amazing. I mean, it obviously does sometimes, but it really has a lot more to do with like the personality and the voice of the person either writing or performing the songs.
Right, that totality, like that kind of spectrum of a performance, I think that is missing from a lot of stuff, because there's that sort of, I don't know if you want to call it virtuoso narcissism, something that you sort of expect out of other genres. Your Jimmy Pages of the world, where you're like, the point is to utterly dominate everybody else, and that's not the case. And I think that sort of creates what you hear in like the New Orleans sound, where we all share members, and it's like really any scene where you can recognize familiar faces back to back. But it's really like we're talking about 30 bands manned by 50 people or something, and this rotates through the year as like Mardi Gras season happens, or the fall tourism season happens, or the summer happens and everyone leaves. But just how many common threads there are behind all these performers is truly remarkable and really wonderful, because I get to be a little bit of both. As a drummer, I get to back people and back my friends and get to like really enjoy that aspect that's more natural to me and what I came up doing. Like, I wasn't the lead performer. I was behind everybody, and I get to do that and get to experience the positive aspects of that, and also get to lead the band. And we all rub off on each other. We play each other's songs. Like since I've been up here on the mountain, I have been trying to dig up little bits of my friends' songs and figure out how to play them. And it's really humbling and crazy to be a part of such a dense concentration of talent, because it's hard to overstate what a remarkable, cool little pocket of things are down there. And it's not all just country, it's again like classic rhythm and blues and ragtime and all sorts of things that are related to country music in a chronological sense, but maybe most people wouldn't want to associate and see on the same night. But we all get to hear this very vast spectrum of music, and we're lucky for it. We're very lucky for it.
Yeah, ownership in country music is very different than most other forms of music. I feel like the idea of like I don't know, like somebody doing the most famous version of a song compared to like the writer of that song, and there's just like this. There's so much to it, and I feel like the music in country music, the songs themselves in country music, is almost communally owned.
Ooh, I like that idea. Totally. Yeah, it's more about owning the experience necessarily than the song, especially if we're playing standards. Like everybody's been so lonesome they can cry. You just have to own that experience and mean it to be able to sing it, not necessarily like be the best at that version.
Well, in 1814, we took a little trip along with Colonel Jackson down the mighty Mississippi. We took a little bacon and we took a little beans, and we met the bloody British near the town of New Orleans. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming, but there wasn't nigh as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to running on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, I seed Mars Jackson a-walking down the street and a-talking to a pirate by the name of Gene Lafitte. He gave Gene a drink that he brung from Tennessee, and the pirate said he'd help us drive the British in the sea. The French told Andrew, you'd better run, for Pakenham's a-coming with a bullet in his gun. Old Hickory said he didn't give a damn, he's a-gonna whip the britches off of Colonel Pakenham. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming, but there wasn't nigh as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to running on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, we looked down the river and we see the British come, and there must have been 100 of them beating on the drum. They stepped so high and they made their bugles ring while we stood beside our cotton bales, didn't say a thing. Old Hickory said we'd take 'em by surprise if we didn't fire a musket till we looked 'em in the eyes. We held our fire till we see their faces well, then we opened up our squirrel guns and really gave 'em hell. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming, but there wasn't nigh as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to running on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, they ran through the briars and they ran through the brambles and they ran through the bushes where a rabbit couldn't go. They ran so fast that the hounds couldn't catch 'em on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, we fired our cannon till the barrel melted down, so we grabbed an alligator and we fought another round. We filled his head with many balls and powdered his behind, and when we touched the powder off, the gator lost his mind. They lost their pants and their pretty shiny coats, and their tails were all a-showing like a bunch of billy goats. They run down the river with their tongues hanging out, and they said they got a licking, which there wasn't any doubt. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming, but there wasn't nigh as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to running on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, we marched back to town in our dirty ragged pants, and we danced all night with them pretty girls from France. We couldn't understand them, but they had the sweetest charms, and we understood them better when we got them in our arms. The guy who brung the British from the sea came a-limping into camp just as sick as he could be. He said the dying words of the Colonel Pakenham was, "You better quit your fooling with your cousin Uncle Sam." We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming, but there wasn't nigh as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to running on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, we'll march back home, but we'll never be content till we make old Hickory the people's president. And every time we think about the bacon and the beans, we'll think about the fun we had way down in New Orleans. We fired our guns and the British kept a-coming, but there wasn't nigh as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to running on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Well, they ran through the briars and they ran through the brambles and they ran through the bushes where a rabbit couldn't go. They ran so fast that the hounds couldn't catch 'em on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. Fired our guns and the British kept a-coming, but there wasn't nigh as many as there was a while ago. We fired once more and they began to running on down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico.
I was reading about Jimmy Driftwood earlier because we're both Jimmy Driftwood fans, and how he wrote the Battle of New Orleans, which became famous because Johnny Horton did it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't really care for Johnny Horton's version at all, probably just because I've heard it 2,000 times, but it's the famous version, and a lot of people really, really love that version. But I tend to like the versions by smaller artists or by Jimmy Driftwood himself that have a little bit more less production value, a little bit more soul to it.
Totally. And the idea that he wrote that as a history lesson for his class, that wasn't him trying to get famous by cutting a catchy recording. He was trying to get his students' attention and teach them history, and that was the byproduct,
Yeah.
But with him specifically, and the songs that he made famous, like Tennessee Stud and Battle in New Orleans and all that, when I play his versions for people, though, I get this interaction often. We're like, "Hey, I've heard this. What is this?" And I have to say, this is the originator. This is who did it. This is this weird history teacher from Arkansas that cut a few records back in the day. But yeah, he's a remarkable person. I don't know if this is the part where we should dive in on Jimmy Driftwood, but I can vaguely see Boxley Valley, and somewhere down in it is the Buffalo River, and his family homesteaded on the Buffalo River and was out here for generations. And I think his songwriting and the sort of timbre of his music is totally a product of this environment. And it's cool to be amongst it for a sustained period and really kind of feel that again. But you can find that in a lot of Arkansas artists. I feel like Almeda Riddle, Ollie Gilbert, Jimmy Driftwood, his father, Neil Morris, they're all products of this kind of idea that in Appalachia, in every holler, there was a couple of fiddle players, and they all had this very rich tradition. But Arkansas and the Ozarks in general only kind of vaguely look like Appalachia. In terms of population density, it's much more empty out here. So instead of there being a fiddler in every holler, there was maybe one in every county. So you get this much more isolated, kind of stranded island effect of the music, and you can hear it in those performers. It's archaic in a really immediate, touchable sense.
Did you get into Arkansas music when you were a kid, Arkansas country music when you were a kid, or did you just start getting into it later once you started digging deeper into country?
Well, you mentioned Johnny Horton. I remember in 5th grade we did the talent show or whatever, and we put on overalls and put on the Battle of New Orleans Johnny Horton version and danced on stage. So I was pretty ignorant, honestly, of most Arkansas music. What I'd heard had basically been that old warbly, country Paulton stuff my grandpa did, or stuff on the radio. But I think it meant more to me when I moved out of Arkansas for the first time, or tried to. I tried to go to art school in Denver for a couple of years right out of high school, and I was homesick and miserable. I'd never lived. I mean, there's more people in Denver than the whole state of Arkansas, so I just immediately got sort of bummed and bought a banjo and started really digging into initially Arkansas old time music. There's a cool collection called Echoes of the Ozarks that's all Ozark string bands from the 20s and 30s playing, the banjo, fiddle, sort of archaic old timey stuff, up the holler music. And I thought that was so cool and so compelling. And really it took me on this whole other journey where I started figuring out all these regional players, and some of them are still alive. Violet Hensley, for example, she's in her hundreds, I believe, at this point, but she's been carving fiddles by hand and playing in Yellville for, Lord, yeah, that amount of times. And she used to break horses and was like a rodeo performer and stuff. So like there's really this thread of performers around here that are so underappreciated. I grew up not really knowing much about it, and then it took me being out of the state and being homesick and really digging into these regional performers to get into it. But I'd say late teens, early 20s, I really started diving into Arkansas music, and specifically, again, the Alameda Riddles and Jimmy Driftwoods of that. But Arkansas music means a lot because the Delta has tons of great blues performers. Charlie Patton lived in Pine Bluff, Arkansas for the latter half of his life. Forest City Joe and Big Bill Brunsey, and Sister Rosetta Tharpe was from East Arkansas. So like there's really a huge spectrum of what you're talking about when you say Arkansas music. But I feel like I really tried to tackle both ends. I played blues, harmonica, and slide guitar before I ever tuned to standard and tried to play country. So I definitely wanted to kind of know the whole spectrum of it all. And it comes from a unique perspective because there's, Arkansas is weird. We have the same amount of people per square mile as Kansas. And think about the vast open, expanses of western Kansas being so empty, and somewhere that's smaller and more compact in a lot of ways, still having fewer people. I mean, there's not really any way to overstate how unique Arkansas is in that our biggest city is 200,000 people ish. So there's not a ton of folks here. So when you get to kind of like understand the perspective of the music that came out of here, it's from that weird island effect, from that depopulated backwater status.
Yeah, and I feel like there's also like obviously like Johnny Cash and stuff, some famous artists who came from Arkansas.
Oh yeah, I missed Cash, damn it.
Yeah. But I mean, I feel like somebody like Jimmy Driftwood more so than somebody like Johnny Cash like owned being from Arkansas. Like he was born there, he spent most of his time there. I mean, he traveled around, but I mean, he stayed there. It was like I feel like he is a voice of Arkansas in a lot of ways.
Totally. And I think it's important to distinguish where they're from also, because Johnny Cash and the Sister Rosetta Tharpes and Forest City Joes, there's people that kind of came from a more diverse blues, gospel, early country crossover, are from the eastern half of the state, which is part of the Cotton Belt and has a really dark history. And I think that a lot of those folks left Arkansas and became who they were in spite of Arkansas. Whereas somebody like Jimmy Driftwood, Alameda Riddle, these lifers, they lived in a part of Arkansas that loved them back a little bit more. The hill country is more forgiving. In some ways, it's harsher in others. But I think that it was easier for them to own Arkansas and to really sort of try to represent it faithfully and in a positive light, because it didn't make them miserable in the same ways that Johnny Cash was made miserable out in the Delta, But Al Green is another example, like totally becoming the performer he was in spite of the state he's from, whereas Jimmy Driftwood, I think, became the performer he was because of where he came from.
Right, yeah. And Jimmy Driftwood, he also, I know I was reading about, he started some sort of coalition to save the river he lived on. Yeah,
like I was saying, I am currently on the backside of some private property that is a tributary of the Buffalo River. And it's the first federally protected river in the country. I think it was 1972. But he created an album that's called Beautiful Buffalo River. I actually have it on vinyl. It's one of my most prized possessions. And it was his ecological effort to get the Buffalo River protected. And it's when I take people here, they'll say stuff like, I didn't think this could be in America. I didn't think that this existed in Arkansas. It's under, actually, don't come here, whatever you do. But at the same time, it's beautiful. I try to tell everybody that I can that wants to know anything about Arkansas or wants to visit. I just say, well, you could skip a lot of the state, but you should definitely go to the Buffalo River because it is unbelievably beautiful. And it's more or less his doing. And he created the Ozark Folk Center State Park and Mountain View. And that's basically like a craft village and Ozark cultural expose where they have knife makers and people making quilts and doing traditional dancing and stuff. It's like a little flagship example of like the peculiar vernacular culture of the area, because people came here from Appalachia in the 19th century when logging and coal were starting to devastate those communities, and they found, essentially a wilderness here. And because Oklahoma was tribally sovereign land, there wasn't westward expansion through the state. So really Arkansas stayed a frontier in a way that other places didn't. And I think it's reflected in the sounds that come out of here.
What are like the traditional jobs for people back in the day in Arkansas? You said it was cotton on the east side, but was it just like small farms and stuff, or was there coal mining?
There's no coal up here. I think that's kind of been the saving grace of the area. We still have this incredibly pristine water and timberland up here, but there was a lot of logging. Logging really screwed the Ozarks specifically up, and the Ouachita Mountains as well, which is kind of a lesser known mountain range in the state. Oh, excuse me. But they really were logged mostly. And in the Ouachitas, you find quartz crystal and diamonds and all sorts of weird stuff like that. But really, it was just, hard scrabble farming. When the French came first it was trapping and all that sort of thing, hunting. But it evolved mostly into trying to farm a very unfarmable area. So it's gardens and then cattle and horses. So really, for the Buffalo River region specifically, Jimmy Driftwood protecting it ecologically created ecotourism. And now there's people that, they've got their old busted trucks and a trailer full of canoes, and that's how they make their money through the year is renting canoes to people that come out here. And like it's changed the character of this area specifically to be much more based on that ecotourism. But back in the day, this was one of the poorest counties in the country. And in some ways still is, but it's remarkable to go in the back roads of Arkansas and how long, especially in the Ozarks, you can go just seeing nothing but trees. You don't see any houses, you don't see farms, you don't see fences. It's just nothing but trees and, winding giant hills. So I think that we got skipped out on economic development in a lot of ways. That's been a blessing in some and obviously had negative consequences in others. But back in the day, it would have been hard scrabble farming and lumber mostly.
Beautiful Buffalo River, more precious than silver and gold, a painting that hangs on a mountain for all of the world to behold. The smile of the Almighty Giver, impressed on the Ozark sublime, fashioned by young Mother Nature and sculpted by old Father Time. Beautiful Buffalo River, glimmering there in the sun. That's Uncle Sam's blue ribbon to show that the people have won. Beautiful Buffalo River, the flag of the mountains unfurled. Arkansas's gift to the nation, America's gift to the world. The dream of the lovers of nature who care for our posterity. They'd love to see beautiful rivers keep flowing through eternity. The mount of the greatest of riders, her saddle a gliding canoe. Sometimes she will carry you gently, sometimes she will bid you adieu. Beautiful Buffalo River, glimmering there in the sun. That's Uncle Sam's blue ribbon to show that the people have won. Beautiful Buffalo River, the flag of the mountains unfurled. Arkansas's gift to the nation, America's gift to the world. The hope of the foes of destruction, of mountains and valleys and plains, with faith that a new generation will save Mother Nature's remains. Now she's a national river, the pride of all races of men, a free-flowing beauty forever, forever and ever, amen. Beautiful Buffalo River, glimmering there in the sun, that's Uncle Sam's blue ribbon to show that the people have won. Beautiful Buffalo River, the flag of the mountains unfurled, Arkansas's gift to the nation, America's gift to the world.
Sorry, this is kind of a 180, but do you think there are multiple? Do you think there's a race of Bigfoots or just one Bigfoot?
I'm in that the panthropic camp, whatever you want to call it. That if Sasquatch, Bigfoot exist, I think it's a genetically viable breeding population. I think it's got to be more than one that is a stranded species of bipedal great ape that's somehow evaded capture. I think it's cool that people fall into the alien camp. I'm all about the alien camp, but me personally, I grew up obsessed with the idea that there were tiny pockets of Gigantopithecus still left in the United States somewhere, and that we were interacting with them. But that's my deal. Is I think Bigfoot is more than one Bigfoot. It
sounds like, from what you're describing Arkansas, it sounds like it's probably the perfect place for Bigfoot to be.
Well, I had a childhood encounter where I heard, we went camping in my parents' woods, as we often did, and heard some kind of light crashing and then this terrible screeching sound. And, all the neighbors were like, oh, you heard a mountain lion, which there are totally mountain lions in Arkansas, even though Game and Fish pretended there weren't for a long time. They told us it was a bobcat, but we were super flipped out. And I remember I probably became the biggest patron of BFRO.net. That is the Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization that any 12-year-old ever should do. I spent way too much time on that website. But I got totally enamored with this and was convinced that we'd had some sort of Sasquatch encounter. And then a few years later, I was out in a different set of woods and heard that same screaming. And the old redneck dude I was with was like, oh, the foxes are at it again. And I was like, wait, what do you mean foxes? And he was like, yeah, the foxes make that noise. That's the red fox screaming. And so I had to realize that the entire basis for my Sasquatch obsession a couple years earlier had been maybe based in false information, but I would like to think that the 2 million some odd acres of Ozark National Forest would be the perfect place for a viable population of bipedal great apes.
Did you go to Arkansas in response to the quarantine, COVID stuff?
Yeah, the big problem was that where both my girlfriend and I live, we have a lot of roommates, and we're in small spaces, we're in shotgun houses. So it kind of felt like the best option for our surroundings, the best way to alleviate New Orleans of more pressure would be for people like us who have the option and are a day's drive from somewhere like Arkansas where they've got places to stay, that we didn't need to be there. I've got a lung condition, and I was afraid that if I were to get sick, that I would probably need to be hospitalized. So I didn't think I could take any resources from lifetime New Orleanians and good conscience. And just, again, if our surroundings have a little bit less stress and we're not there, that's probably the best thing for it. So we had the option and decided that a city that doesn't handle disasters very well historically probably wasn't a good place to be. So we headed for the hills in a very literal sense.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty good place to kind of weather the storm, honestly.
I agree, and Arkansas has been kind of bumming me out in terms of policy decisions. We don't have a stay-at-home order, but that we don't have an international airport. We've got like 2 interstates tops, a state of 2 million people with its biggest city at 150, 200,000, whatever you want to call it. So we really have a lot working for us in terms of this not being a very viable place for the pandemic to get much worse. And the numbers have been kind of affirming that as I've watched this play out. Arkansas is still, and I think it's in the bottom 15 of number of infections. But it felt like the right thing to do at the time, and it has not gotten scary at all. We've been fighting a lot of pangs and a lot of guilt about maybe leaving New Orleans behind, but it still has always felt like the right thing to do, and has we've been very, very happy and very blessed to have a sort of stable little enclave up here.
That's good, man. Yeah, I've just been staying at home for the most part, but it would be cool to be able to like go out and go on nice walks like in the forest and stuff.
Yeah, that's been the daily is doing so many woods walks, but we're above all this undeveloped property that I guess somebody just turkey hunts a couple times a year, and otherwise it's just a couple thousand acres of empty upper Buffalo wilderness. So we've kind of had the run of the place, and it's been really nice. It's been also a wonder for our mental health, because New Orleans is where we live, but we're both from smaller, greener places, so it's been really grand, I think, to kind of be able to get out and reset and reassess and feel like we're doing the right thing.
All right, man. Well, have a good night. I'm gonna go cook some dinner.
Yeah, man. I appreciate you so much for hitting me up. This has been really fun. We're gonna do about the same thing here soon.
And that's it, folks. I want to thank you for listening to the first episode of the Dollar Country interview podcast, or Dollar Country interviewed episodes on the regular Dollar Country show. So, as always, if you'd like to get a hold of me, you can do so at host@dollarcountry.org. Follow me on Instagram, Facebook, or Twitter at Dollar Country, all one word. And if you'd like some free stickers or buy some Dollar Country merch, including mixtapes, mix CDs, shirts, tote bags, all that kind of stuff, you can go to bigcartel.com/dollarcountry, or wait, actually I think it's dollarcountry.bigcartel.com, or check out any other episodes at dollarcountry.org. And of course, before signing off, I would like to thank Nick Shoulders for chatting with me, and I'd like to say to you, remember to be nice to people out there, because you never know what kind of day someone else has been having. A little bit of niceness can go a long way. So this is Frank the Drifter signing off, and I will see you next time.